A jury foreperson stands up. In their hand is a single sheet of paper that will define the rest of a man's life. In the gallery, families on opposite sides of the room hold their breath for entirely different reasons. One side is praying for justice. The other is praying for freedom. These are the moments football never prepares you for. No amount of film study, no strength coach, no playbook can get a man ready for the second a verdict is read in a murder case with his name on it. This video is about 4 men who wore NFL uniforms and also, at some point, stood in the crosshairs of the American justice system on the most serious charge that system has: murder. Some walked into a courtroom and walked out acquitted. One never even saw formal charges filed, despite a cloud of suspicion that followed him for years. One had murder charges dropped entirely as part of a deal that still shapes how we remember him today. We're not here to tell you what to believe about guilt or innocence. That's not our job, and frankly, it was never ours to decide that's what the legal system, for all its flaws, exists to determine. What we are here to do is lay out exactly what happened, in the order it happened, backed by court records, police statements, and trial testimony, so you can see the full picture for yourself. Before we dive in, hit subscribe, because we cover the stories the NFL's own highlight reels will never show you. Let's start with the most recent case on this list, a shooting outside a Florida home that ended with a jury verdict and a former Giants receiver walking free. Travis Rudolph. The 7th of April 2021. Lake Park, Florida. Travis Rudolph, a former Florida State standout who had spent parts of 2 seasons in the NFL with the New York Giants and Miami Dolphins, is at his home following an altercation with his girlfriend, Dominique Jones. Hours later, according to investigators, 4 men arrived at Rudolph's house. What happened next would end with 1 man dead, another wounded, and Travis Rudolph facing the single most serious charge that exists in American law: first-degree murder, along with 3 counts of attempted murder. Prosecutors said Rudolph armed himself with a semi-automatic rifle as the confrontation escalated. As the men's SUV drove away from the property, Rudolph opened fire 39 shots, according to investigators, fired in the direction of the fleeing vehicle. Sebastian Jean-Jacques was killed. A second man, Tyler Robinson, was wounded. Rudolph was arrested and charged. His football career, already fading after a knee injury had pushed him out of the league, was now the least of his concerns. He faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. His defense rested on a single claim: self-defense. Rudolph testified that the men who came to his home were armed and that they fired at him first as he defended his property and his life. Florida's Stand Your Ground law, one of the most consequential and debated statutes in the state's legal code, became central to the case. Rudolph's attorneys initially sought to have the case dismissed entirely under that law before trial. A judge declined, sending the case to a jury instead. At trial, prosecutors pushed back hard on the self-defense narrative. Investigators testified that they found no evidence the fleeing men had fired back at Rudolph, no shell casings from a second weapon, no bullet damage to Rudolph's property consistent with return fire. To the prosecution, this wasn't a defensive shooting. It was an execution of unarmed men as they tried to flee. For 2 years, the case hung over Rudolph. 2 years of house arrest, hearings, and a football career permanently on hold, waiting for 12 strangers to decide his fate. On the 7th of June 2023, that jury returned its verdict: not guilty. On every single count. Not guilty of first-degree murder. Not guilty of attempted murder, all 3 counts. The jury didn't even convict him on lesser-included offenses like second-degree murder or manslaughter, options that were available to them if they believed the case fell short of the original charges, but still amounted to something. They chose none of it. Travis Rudolph walked out of the Palm Beach County Courthouse a free man, embraced by his family, telling reporters he intended to celebrate and get back to trying to play football. To this day, opinions on the verdict remain sharply divided. Supporters of the jury's decision point to Rudolph's testimony and the Stand Your Ground protections written into Florida law specifically for moments like this. Critics point to 39 shots fired at a car that was already driving away and to a family that lost a son and will never get a different verdict no matter how they feel about it. Both of those things, the verdict and the grief, exist in the same case, at the same time, and neither one erases the other. It's worth understanding why Florida's Stand Your Ground law played such a central role here, because it's a piece of legislation that shows up again and again in cases like this one. Unlike a traditional self-defense claim, which typically requires a person to first attempt to retreat from danger before using deadly force, Stand Your Ground removes that requirement entirely, as long as the person reasonably believes deadly force is necessary to prevent death or serious injury. Rudolph's legal team leaned on that distinction heavily, arguing that even if he could have retreated further into his own home, the law never required him to. Prosecutors, in turn, argued that the absence of a retreat requirement doesn't erase the requirement that the belief itself be reasonable, and that firing 39 rounds at a vehicle already in motion, driving away from the property, stretched the definition of reasonable past its breaking point. The jury didn't explain its reasoning publicly, and juries in criminal trials typically never do. All that exists on the public record is the verdict itself, not guilty, across every count. Delivered after Rudolph's team built a defense, the jury ultimately found convincing enough to clear a threshold as serious as first-degree murder. Next, Marvin Harrison. Now, here's a case that plays out differently than the others on this list, and it's important we're precise about exactly what did and didn't happen, because the facts here matter more than the rumors that followed them. Marvin Harrison is a Pro Football Hall of Famer, one of the greatest wide receivers to ever put on an Indianapolis Colts uniform. Off the field, back in his old North Philadelphia neighborhood, he owned several small businesses, a car wash, a garage, and a bar called Playmakers. On the 29th of April 2008, a shooting occurred near that car wash. A man named Dwight Dixon was struck in the hand by gunfire. According to police, Dixon and Harrison had a history, a 2-week feud that reportedly began after Dixon was thrown out of Harrison's bar. Investigators recovered shell casings at the scene. Ballistics testing matched most of them to a handgun registered to Harrison, a Belgian-made FN-57 pistol. Here's where the story gets complicated. Harrison was questioned by police. He told investigators that his gun had never left his possession, that it was secured at his suburban home, untouched since he'd purchased it years earlier. He denied any involvement in the shooting. Police say they recovered projectiles from a second weapon at the scene that was never located or identified. For months, the investigation remained open. Witnesses gave conflicting and in some cases, outright false statements. One man, Robert Nixon, claimed he'd been wounded by stray gunfire at the scene and initially told police he saw Harrison fire the weapon, but Nixon later admitted to fabricating parts of his account and was ultimately jailed on an unrelated charge for lying to investigators. Dixon himself gave hospital staff a false name and an entirely different story about how he was shot before changing his account days later. In January 2009, then Philadelphia District Attorney Lynn Abraham announced her decision on the case, and it's important to state clearly what that decision actually was. She did not clear Harrison of wrongdoing, but she did not charge him either. Abraham cited what she described as multiple, conflicting, and unreliable statements from the people present that day, a case built on witnesses she said she could not put in front of a jury with confidence. She was candid that she believed she knew who fired the weapon. She was equally candid that belief wasn't the same as proof, and proof was what the law required. No charges. Not against Harrison. Not against anyone. Marvin Harrison was never arrested in connection with this case. He was never formally named a suspect by police. He was never indicted. He was never put on trial. Legally speaking, there is a significant difference between investigated and charged, and Harrison's case never crossed that line. The story resurfaced in the worst possible way in July 2009, when Dwight Dixon, the same man wounded in the 2008 incident, was killed in an entirely separate shooting a few blocks from Harrison's businesses. Surveillance footage showed an unknown gunman in a hooded sweatshirt approaching Dixon's car and opening fire. The location's proximity to Harrison's properties, combined with the earlier case, drew fresh scrutiny, and the Philadelphia Police Department brought in the FBI to determine whether the two shootings were connected. But scrutiny is not evidence, and speculation is not a charge. No charges were ever filed against Harrison in Dixon's death either. To date, no one has been convicted of killing Dwight Dixon. Harrison did face a civil lawsuit from Robert Nixon over the 2008 incident, a separate legal track from criminal prosecution with a lower burden of proof, but that is a fundamentally different matter from a murder charge, and conflating the two does Harrison and the facts of this case a disservice. So where does that leave Marvin Harrison on a list like this one? Technically, he doesn't belong in the same category as the other names here, men who stood trial or who had actual murder charges filed and then dropped. Harrison's story is really a story about the limits of suspicion in the American legal system. A gun that was his, a victim who later died under circumstances that were never solved, and a prosecutor who looked at everything available and decided that suspicion, however strong, was not the same thing as proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a distinction that matters more than it might seem. In American criminal law, an investigation and a charge are not 2 points on the same line, they're two entirely different legal categories. Thousands of people are investigated by police every year in connection with serious crimes and never charged with anything because investigators, and ultimately prosecutors, determine the evidence doesn't clear the threshold the law demands. That's not a loophole or a failure of the system. It's the system working exactly as it's designed to, protecting people from the enormous weight of a criminal charge unless the evidence genuinely supports it. Marvin Harrison went on to be inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2016, years after this investigation closed without charges, a fact that underscores just how differently his story unfolded compared to the other men on this list. Next, Ray Lewis. Now we come to one of the most notorious nights in NFL off-field history, a night that began at a Super Bowl party and ended with two men dead on an Atlanta street. In the early morning hours of the 31st of January 2000, following Super Bowl XXX84, a fight broke out outside the Cobalt Lounge in Atlanta's Buckhead Entertainment District. Ray Lewis, the Baltimore Ravens star linebacker, was there that night with a group that included two friends, Reginald Oakley and Joseph Sweeting. By the end of the altercation, Jacinth Baker and Richard Lawler had been stabbed to death. Lewis and his two companions fled the scene in a limousine. Police say the limo driver later told investigators that Lewis instructed everyone in the vehicle to keep quiet about what happened. Lewis, Oakley and Sweeting were all charged with murder. For the NFL, this was an unprecedented crisis. A star player, one of the faces of the league, charged with murder in connection with a double homicide in the immediate aftermath of the sport's biggest game. The pressure on prosecutors, on Lewis's legal team, and on Lewis personally was immense. As the case developed, the evidence against Lewis specifically became a subject of significant dispute. Prosecutors could not conclusively establish who delivered the fatal stab wounds. Physical evidence connecting Lewis directly to the killings as opposed to his presence at the scene and his conduct afterward was, by the account of the prosecution's own team, not strong enough to guarantee a conviction on the murder charges as filed. In June 2000, a deal was reached. In exchange for Lewis's truthful testimony against Oakley and Sweeting, prosecutors agreed to drop the murder charges against him entirely. Lewis pleaded guilty to a single charge of obstruction of justice, acknowledging that he had not been forthcoming with investigators in the immediate aftermath of the killings. He was sentenced to 12 months of probation and fined $250,000 by the NFL separately for violating the league's conduct policy. Oakley and Sweeting went to trial. Both were acquitted of murder. To this day, no one has ever been convicted in connection with the deaths of Jacinth Baker and Richard Lawler. The families of both men have spent decades without the legal closure a conviction would have provided, while Ray Lewis went on to have one of the greatest careers in NFL history, a two-time Super Bowl champion, a 13-time Pro Bowl selection, and, in 2018, a first-ballot inductee into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. That contrasts a Hall of Fame bust in Canton, Ohio, standing alongside a case that never produced a single conviction for 2 deaths in Atlanta, remains one of the most uncomfortable juxtapositions in modern NFL history. Lewis has spoken about that night in the years since, describing it as the darkest moment of his life and pointing to his subsequent faith and philanthropy as an attempt to build something meaningful in its wake. Whether that's viewed as redemption or as a convenient narrative largely depends on who you ask, and that division isn't going away anytime soon. It's also worth understanding just how quickly the NFL's relationship with Lewis shifted after that plea deal. Once the murder charges were dropped and the case resolved with probation and a fine, the league's punishment was, by most measures, relatively light for a case that had begun with a double homicide charge. Lewis returned to the Ravens for the 2000 season and delivered arguably the finest year of his career, anchoring a defense that is still discussed today as one of the greatest units in NFL history, allowing the fewest points in a 1-6 game season of the modern era. That Ravens team went on to win Super Bowl 25, and Lewis was named the game's most valuable player, a title he held less than a year after murder charges against him had been dropped. That timeline is exactly why this case continues to generate discomfort decades later. It isn't simply that the charges were dropped. Plenty of cases end that way for legitimate evidentiary reasons. It's the speed and scale of Lewis's return to the top of his profession, culminating in the league's ultimate individual honor on its biggest stage, all while the families of Jacinth Baker and Richard Lawler were left with no convictions, no closure, and a national audience that largely moved on to celebrate the man who had once stood charged in connection with their deaths. Next, O.J. Simpson. No list like this one is complete without the case that, more than any other in American history, turned a courtroom into a stage watched by the entire country. On the 12th of June 1994, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were found stabbed to death outside her home in Brentwood, California. Nicole was the ex-wife of O.J. Simpson, a Heisman Trophy winner, a Pro Football Hall of Fame running back, and by that point in his life, one of the most recognizable media personalities in America, known for broadcasting work and film roles as much as for his playing career. 5 days later, the world watched live as police pursued a white Ford Bronco down a Los Angeles freeway, with Simpson inside in a chase carried on every major network, watched by an estimated 95 million people. It ended at Simpson's home, where he was taken into custody and charged with 2 counts of murder. What followed was, by any measure, the most publicized criminal trial in American history. It stretched across 8 months, from January to October of 1995. It produced 126 witnesses and over 1,000 pieces of physical evidence. It introduced the country to names that are still remembered decades later: Johnny Cochran, Marsha Clark, Judge Lance Ito, and a bloody glove that would become the trial's single most famous piece of evidence. Prosecutors built their case on a substantial body of forensic evidence DNA found at the crime scene, a trail of blood leading from the scene towards Simpson's home, and a documented history of domestic violence between Simpson and his ex-wife that they argued established motive. Simpson's defense team, led by Cochran, mounted a case built on 2 central arguments: that the physical evidence had been mishandled, contaminated, or in the most serious allegations planted, and that the Los Angeles Police Department's investigation was compromised by racial bias, an argument given enormous weight by the testimony and recorded statements of one of the lead detectives on the case. The defining moment of the entire trial came when Simpson was asked to try on the leather gloves recovered from the crime scene, and they appeared not to fit. Cochran's closing argument, built around that moment, produced one of the most quoted lines in American legal history: "If it doesn't fit, the jury must acquit." On the 3rd of October 1995, after less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: not guilty on both counts of murder. The reaction split the country almost perfectly along racial lines, a divide that polling captured in stark terms in the days that followed, and that divide, in many ways, has never fully closed in the decades since. For many Black Americans, the verdict was viewed as a rare moment when the justice system, historically stacked against Black defendants, worked in favor of one. For many white Americans, the verdict was viewed as a case where fame and a highly paid legal team overcame what they saw as overwhelming evidence of guilt. Simpson's story did not end with the acquittal. In 1997, in a civil trial with a lower burden of proof than a criminal case, a jury found Simpson liable for the deaths of both victims and ordered him to pay $33.5 million in damages to their families, a judgment he spent years avoiding by relocating to Florida, a state with strong protections against the seizure of pensions and certain assets. In 2007, Simpson was arrested again, this time in Las Vegas, in connection with an armed robbery and kidnapping case involving sports memorabilia he claimed had been stolen from him originally. In 2008, he was convicted on all charges and sentenced to a minimum of 9 years in prison. He was granted parole in 2017. O.J. Simpson died in April 2024, more than a decade removed from a trial that, to this day, remains the standard against which every other celebrity murder case in American history is measured. It's difficult to overstate just how completely this trial saturated American culture in 1995. The Los Angeles Times ran coverage of the case on its front page for more than 300 consecutive days. Nightly network news broadcasts reportedly devoted more combined airtime to the Simpson trial than to the Bosnian War, and the Oklahoma City bombing put together two of the most significant news events of that entire decade. Estimates of lost national workplace productivity, as employees followed the live proceedings instead of working, ran into the tens of billions of dollars. Legal analysts who became household names during the trial went on to build entire media careers off the moment, and the case is widely credited with helping launch the modern era of televised courtroom coverage. In the years since, the key figures in the case have continued to litigate its meaning outside the courtroom, through books, documentaries, and interviews. Prosecutor Marcia Clark wrote that she believed the acquittal reflected a justice system still compromised by the influence of race and celebrity, arguing the physical evidence alone should have been sufficient for conviction. Defense attorney Robert Shapiro, by contrast, maintained that reasonable doubt genuinely existed in the case, independent of any argument about race, and criticized his own co-counsel for leaning too heavily into that argument during the trial. Detective Mark Fuhrman, whose recorded statements became a central piece of the defense's case, spent years afterward defending himself against accusations that his conduct during the investigation had compromised the prosecution's evidence. Nearly 3 decades later, historians, legal scholars, and documentary filmmakers are still returning to this case, not because the verdict itself remains in doubt, but because of what it revealed about race, celebrity, and trust in law enforcement in 1990s America questions the country is, in many ways, still working through today. None of these stories have a clean, satisfying ending. That's not a failure of this video, that's simply what these cases actually are. The American legal system is built around a specific, deliberately difficult standard: guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard exists to protect the innocent from wrongful conviction, and it does that job by design, even when it means some cases end without the certainty that families, fans, and the public desperately want. What you take away from these 4 stories, whether it's faith in a justice system that refuses to convict without overwhelming proof, or frustration with a system that seems to bend around fame and money, is genuinely up to you. We laid out what happened, in the order it happened, as close to the documented record as we could get it. The rest of the verdict, the one that matters most, is the one you reach on your own. If this video gave you a clearer picture than what you'd heard before, do us a favor, hit subscribe, drop a comment with which of these 4 cases you find most unsettling, and share this with someone who thinks they already know the full story on one of these names. Chances are they didn't know all of it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.